They said the Ardennes was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that swallows sound and makes a soldier believe he might actually survive the next hour. But at dawn on a freezing December morning in 1944, as German infantry pushed cautiously through the snow-drowned woods, something impossible happened. Without a single ranging shot, without even the whisper of a warning, the sky tore open above them, and an entire grid square erupted in perfectly timed American artillery fire, shells landing so simultaneously that veterans later swore it felt as if the earth had risen up to kill them. And in that moment, amid the shattering explosions and the white shrapnel bursts slicing through the fog, the question echoed across the battlefield. How had the Americans done this? How had they turned ordinary howitzers into instruments of near-instant annihilation, capable of striking with a precision and synchronization the Germans had never encountered before? To the men caught beneath that sudden rain of steel, it felt like sorcery, like the Americans had somehow bent time and space. But the truth, buried behind fire direction centers, wooden tables, and the hands of anonymous artillerymen, was even stranger. Because what made every German grid square a death trap wasn't a secret weapon or a miracle caliber. It was a forgotten invention, created years earlier by an obscure captain in Oklahoma. A tool so simple and unassuming that no one on that battlefield could have imagined it was the quiet engine behind the most devastating artillery trick of the Second World War. Artillery was supposed to be slow, clumsy, and late. Before this hidden innovation rewired the tempo of battle, artillery was a creature of minutes, long, precious minutes that too often decided who lived and who died. Because for generations, a call for fire set off a laborious chain of manual calculations inside a fire direction center, where officers and enlisted specialists hunched over plotting boards, paper firing tables, protractors and range scales, converting an observer's shouted grid into firing data through step-by-step mathematics that could take 3 to 5 agonizing minutes under ideal conditions, and far longer under stress. And in combat, that delay was deadly, because by the time the numbers were checked, rechecked, and shouted to the guns, the enemy had usually moved, ducked for cover, or slipped back into the tree line, leaving American shells to detonate harmlessly in empty fields, while German units regrouped and struck again. Artillery, the so-called king of battle, was undeniably powerful, but it was also predictable. The first shots were rarely accurate, spotted corrections took time, and batteries could not coordinate perfectly because each gun line was trapped behind the same slow mathematics, fumbling through procedures that made simultaneous fire all but impossible. Everyone knew the limitation, and everyone accepted it as the natural pace of things, an immutable truth of warfare. Until one day, a junior officer in Oklahoma decided that wasting minutes was no longer acceptable, and the entire script of modern firepower began to change. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, 1940. An impatient captain with a wooden idea. 4 years before the Ardennes exploded in fire, in the wide, wind-scoured plains of Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the beating heart of American artillery training, a young instructor named Captain Abbott Harrington Burns watched his students struggle through firing calculations with growing frustration, listening to pencils scratch and erasers squeak as precious minutes bled away. And he found himself asking a question almost no one else bothered to ask. Why does this take so long? Burns was not a theorist or a visionary in the traditional sense. He was a practical, restless officer obsessed with efficiency, a man who believed that if artillery was to dominate the fast machine-age battlefield, its brains, the fire direction centers, had to think faster than its guns could fire. So in November 1940, motivated not by ambition or glory, but by sheer irritation at wasted time, he began tinkering with a simple wooden device, carving and sliding pieces by hand until he produced something revolutionary. The Graphical Firing Table, a compact, rugged slide rule that replaced pages of trigonometry with a set of instantly readable curves and scales. With that invention, Burns wasn't trying to change the course of the war. America wasn't even in the war yet. He was simply trying to solve a classroom problem. But tucked inside that wooden frame was an idea that would one day help turn frozen Belgian ridges into immovable walls of fire, and transform the very rhythm of American artillery from slow and plodding to impossibly fast. How a wooden slide rule started bending time. Burns' graphical firing table looked humble, just wood, inked lines, and sliding scales. But inside that simplicity lay a radical reimagining of how artillerymen could think. Because instead of forcing crews to crunch numbers by hand for range, deflection, charge, air temperature, powder lot variations, and meteorological drift, the device translated all of those factors into visual curves that could be aligned in seconds, letting a gun crew read the firing solution directly off the scales without touching a pencil. And suddenly, what once took 3 to 5 anxious minutes became a task completed in 20 or 30 seconds, even under the stress of incoming fire. For the first time, dispersed batteries miles apart could produce synchronized firing data fast enough to act as a single organism, responding to a forward observer's call almost instantly, shaping battles not with brute force, but with speed. Speed that denied enemy units the time to scatter, dig in, or counterattack. It was this collapse of calculation time that opened the door to a new battlefield reality. Artillery no longer followed the fight at a distance. It moved with it, surrounded it, smothered it. Burns' slide rule didn't just make guns accurate, it made them coordinated, turning minutes into moments, and moments into deadly precision. The true weapon was no longer metal or explosive. It was time itself, bent and compressed until American firepower seemed to arrive all at once, everywhere the enemy dared to stand. From classroom curiosity to the gunner's secret weapon. At first, the graphical firing table was little more than a clever teaching aid, circulating quietly among instructors and forward-thinking officers at Fort Sill. A tool admired for its neatness, but not yet recognized for its battlefield potential. And when Burns pushed his design upward, he met the familiar mix of military skepticism and bureaucratic inertia. Because surely, senior officers reasoned, if artillery calculations could be sped up so drastically, someone would have done it already. Yet while headquarters hesitated, the field embraced it. Young lieutenants copied Burns's prototypes, fire direction centers requested more units, and word spread from battalion to battalion that this simple wooden device could cut precious minutes off every mission. By the time the United States plunged into World War II, the graphical firing table had slipped into the toolkit of America's growing artillery arm almost by osmosis, not mandated from Washington, but championed by the men who actually had to deliver fire on real enemies under real pressure. It became the quiet equalizer, the unglamorous companion to every plotting board and field phone, tucked into the hands of sergeants and corporals who discovered that with this tool, their batteries could think and react at a speed other armies simply couldn't match. What began as one captain's attempt to make training less tedious became, almost accidentally, the backbone of a revolutionary system of fire control, an innovation born not from grand doctrine but from the pragmatic instincts of the soldiers who knew that in war, time is the most precious ammunition of all. Inventing the trick, making every shell land at the same instant. What the graphical firing table truly unlocked was not just speed, but synchrony, the ability to choreograph artillery fire with such precision that entire battalions could strike as one. And from this new tempo emerged the most feared American artillery tactic of the war: time on target, a method so devastatingly effective that German veterans later described it as being hit by lightning without a thunderclap. The concept was elegantly brutal. When an observer called for fire, each battery calculated not only its firing data, but also the exact delay required so that all shells, fired from guns at different ranges and different positions, would arrive at the target at the same instant. Before Burns's invention, such timing was impossible. The math simply took too long, and coordination collapsed under the weight of manual calculations. But now, with solutions ready in seconds, Fire direction centers could issue staggered firing orders with mathematical confidence, allowing guns miles apart to unleash their rounds in a perfectly synchronized wave. There were no warning salvos, no bracketing shots, just sudden, cataclysmic impact. A German unit caught in a time-on-target strike had no time to run, dive, scatter, or hide. One moment the world was still, the next it was split open by dozens or hundreds of shells detonating simultaneously, ripping through columns, command posts, assembly areas, and defensive positions before anyone even understood they were under attack. Time on target was the purest expression of America's new artillery philosophy, not slow correction, but instant perfection, not probing fire, but overwhelming annihilation delivered in a single deadly heartbeat. Hitler's last gamble meets America's new way of firing. By December 1944, as the German High Command launched its desperate Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last throw of the dice, the true power of America's new artillery method was about to be tested on a scale no one had imagined. Because when the 6th SS Panzer Army surged westward through the snowy forests, the Allies were caught off guard, their aircraft grounded by fog, their lines thin and scattered, and, for the first crucial days of the Battle of the Bulge, artillery, not tanks, not aircraft, became the backbone of American resistance. On the northern shoulder of the German attack lay a stretch of high ground called Elsenborn Ridge, a modest rise in the Belgian landscape that commanded the roads the enemy desperately needed to reach Liège. If the Germans broke through here, the entire front could unravel. If the Americans held it, Hitler's plan would stall. And as panzer formations punched forward and infantry battalions struggled through deep snowdrifts, they ran headlong into something they had not expected: an American artillery system that could react faster than German units could advance, striking with ruthless precision even in the thick Ardennes fog. Here, time-on-target tactics would transform the ridge into an immovable wall of fire, giving thinly spread American infantry an invisible ally, an artillery arm that could hit like a sledgehammer with only seconds of warning, shaping the battle long before the first tank ever crested the ridgeline. Elsenborn Ridge, turning Belgian snowfields into a killing ground. When the German assault slammed into Elsenborn Ridge, they expected to brush aside the thin American lines and pour through the northern corridor toward Liège. But instead they found themselves hitting an invisible barricade. 348 American guns massed under Brigadier General John Hamilton Hines, the largest and most concentrated artillery force the U.S. Army had ever assembled, all wired together through modern fire direction centers and armed with the speed granted by graphical firing tables. From behind the ridge, unseen and untouched, these guns turned every approach route, forest clearing and snow-covered field into a meticulously plotted kill zone. And whenever German columns attempted to advance, observers hidden on the ridge called down time-on-target missions that erupted across the landscape in deafening unison. Tanks jammed on narrow roads were obliterated before their crews even understood they'd been spotted. Infantry battalions forming up for attacks were cut to pieces by shells bursting above them in air-shredding arcs. Transport convoys trying to push forward under the cover of darkness were erased in seconds by barrages that arrived without a single ranging shot. The ridge itself became a fortress made of mathematics and timing, an artillery citadel whose power didn't come from concrete or barbed wire, but from coordination so flawless that German units described the experience as walking into a trap that closed faster than they could react. With every failed push, the German timetable slipped, their momentum faltered, and the great offensive that Hitler had promised would split the Allied front instead ground to a halt in the snow, broken not by massed armor or overwhelming infantry, but by the orchestrated fury of American guns firing with a precision no German commander had believed possible. Inside the fire direction centers, where the real battle was fought. Behind the thunder of those 348 guns, far from the frontline foxholes and tank duels, sat the nerve centers that truly decided the fate of Elsenborn Ridge. The fire direction centers, cramped tents or makeshift huts lit by dim lanterns, where lieutenants hunched over field phones, sergeants crouched above plotting boards, and enlisted computers, the men who ran the graphical firing tables, worked with a calm precision that belied the chaos unfolding miles ahead. A single call for fire might begin with the shaky voice of a forward observer reporting a column of panzers edging along a forest road. Instantly, phones crackled, pencils flew, and hands darted across Burns's wooden slide rules as the FDC converted the target grid into firing solutions in a matter of seconds, verifying range, direction, charge, and fuse settings with mechanical efficiency. While one clerk calculated elevation, another transmitted the firing order. While one section aligned the curves of the graphical firing table, another synchronized the timing required for a time-on-target strike. Inside these tense but methodical rooms, war became a form of orchestration. Every number placed correctly meant shells would fall exactly where they were needed, at the exact second required. There was no drama, no shouting, no frantic chaos. Only the steady discipline of soldiers who understood that their accuracy and speed were the only thing standing between the American line and complete collapse. Out on the ridge, the Germans felt only the final result, a crushing wall of steel that seemed to materialize from thin air. But its origins were here, in these small, crowded spaces, where anonymous young men wielded their slide rules like weapons, bending time and distance into a lethal harmony that turned the battlefield into a death trap, long before a single gun ever fired. On the German side of the hill, it felt like sorcery. For the German soldiers pushing toward Elsenborn Ridge, the American artillery did not behave like anything they had encountered on the Eastern Front, in Italy, or even in Normandy. It felt unnatural, uncanny, almost supernatural, because the barrages struck without warning, without ranging shots, without the familiar rhythm of adjustment fire. Shells simply materialized overhead and detonated in perfect simultaneity, tearing into armored columns and infantry formations before anyone could dive into a foxhole or shout a command. Panther and Tiger crews, confident in the thick armor of their machines, suddenly found themselves helpless as proximity-fused shells burst above their tanks, showering thin top armor with razor-edged shrapnel. Infantry companies, ordered to advance through the fog, refused to leave their cover after watching entire squads vanish under a single time-on-target strike that seemed to arrive out of nowhere. Unit diaries from the 12th SS Panzer Division describe American fire as instantaneous and precise, hitting march routes the moment vehicles bunched up, pulverizing assembly areas before attacks could form, and hammering retreat paths so quickly that withdrawal became suicidal. To German officers, it felt as if the Americans had an invisible reconnaissance network, or worse, a supernatural sense for where their troops were gathering. But the truth was far more methodical. Superior communications, rapid-fire calculation made possible by graphical firing tables, and the disciplined choreography of time-on-target tactics that simply outpaced German decision cycles. What the Germans interpreted as ominous, unexplainable timing was in reality the cold, mechanical efficiency of an artillery system that no longer behaved like the slow, predictable guns of old. On the receiving end, it felt like sorcery. In reality, it was the science of speed, coordination, and a slide rule that allowed American gunners to make time itself their deadliest weapon. A forgotten slide rule that helped break Hitler's last attack. By the time the smoke began to lift over Elsenborn Ridge, the truth was undeniable. Hitler's grand northern thrust, led by the elite 6th SS Panzer Army and intended to punch straight through to Liège, had been stopped cold, not by overwhelming numbers or armored superiority, but by an American artillery system that thought and acted faster than the German offensive could unfold. The failure of the German advance in this sector became one of the decisive turning points of the Battle of the Bulge. While other parts of the front reeled and bent under the surprise of the Ardennes attack, the northern shoulder held firm, anchored by the fury of 348 guns, firing with a speed and synchronization the enemy had never anticipated. That stability allowed American reinforcements to move, prevented the encirclement of critical supply lines, and denied the Germans access to the road network their entire plan depended on. Yet the engine behind this success, the Graphical Firing Table, remained an unheralded detail buried beneath the larger story of the Bulge. Burns's simple wooden invention, born years earlier in an Oklahoma classroom, had quietly magnified America's artillery dominance at the exact moment history demanded it, slashing calculation times, enabling flawless time-on-target missions, and saving untold American lives by crushing German assaults before they could take shape. When historians recount the Bulge, they speak of weather, tanks, commanders, and terrain. But behind every saved position and every repelled assault on that frigid ridge was a device so unassuming that most soldiers never remembered its name, even though its impact helped break the last great attack Hitler would ever launch in the West. What a wooden slide rule can still teach us about war and innovation. In the end, the story of the Graphical Firing Table is not just about artillery, or even about victory in the Ardennes. It is a reminder that history often turns not on dramatic speeches or famous generals, but on the small, practical ideas born in workshops, classrooms, and field tents far from the roar of battle. Captain Abbott Harrington Burns never set out to reshape warfare. He simply wanted to stop wasting minutes. Yet his wooden slide rule, adopted quietly by the men who needed it most, allowed American artillery to think faster, strike harder, and coordinate with a precision unmatched anywhere in the world, giving US forces the edge they needed not only at Elsenborn Ridge, but across the European and Pacific theatres. It teaches us that innovation on the battlefield rarely comes from grand theory. Instead, it lives in the hands of the soldiers who solve the problems right in front of them, whose small efficiencies, multiplied across thousands of moments, can alter the course of a war. And as we return one last time to that frozen German column, stepping into the silent Ardennes woods, only to be swallowed by an impossible barrage that seemed to fall from the sky all at once, we can finally answer the question that echoed across that shattered snowfield. The devastating power they faced did not come from magic or mystery, but from a simple wooden slide rule carved by a captain who understood that in war, the most ordinary tool, if it saves time, can become the most extraordinary weapon of all.